Okay, hi, welcome. I'm so glad to have you both here and get a chance to sit down with two of my favorite people and mentors in the EMDR and therapy world. So I was sort of thinking about how, to approach this. And one of the things I was thinking is what you've both brought to EMDR. I mean, first of all, our connection first starts with EMDR. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But both of you have elevated, in my opinion, EMDR, upgraded it in different ways, but actually really similar ways underneath within different models. So I kind of want to talk about that. But if we could just start with why EMDR, how you came to EMDR, and what your history of that was. Roy, you want to start?
Oh, okay. So how I got into EMDR? Well, somebody talked me into it in 1995. I got this flyer and I said, "What is this?" And they said, "Roy, you're a Gestaltist. You'll like this." And so I just jumped in and went through the level 1 and level 2 with Francine within about 6 or 8 weeks of each other and started using it and found it very helpful for the clients that I had already aligned up with. And then my growth in the community is I've always enjoyed teaching. And so as soon as I was able to be in a position to be a facilitator back in the 90s, there weren't many when Francine was building that organization. So I had an opportunity to start doing that. And then as part of that process and getting into that inner circle of Francine's group, I volunteered to be the international list moderator, which gave me a lot of ideas about what was working and areas where people continue to bring up questions. And then through that process, and I had an opportunity to volunteer overseas in Bangladesh, which got me a little bit more closely in the organization, to the point where Francine invited me to become a trainer for the humanitarian program in 2001. And from 2001 to 13, I trained for mostly community mental health agencies for that organization, which really created a difference in the client population that you saw in the commercial trainings, because I started training for Francine's Institute in 2006. And so there really was two different components. And out of that process, I realized that there were some things that I felt were more important to add, things that we had evolved with our knowledge of the brain. And so I left their organizations in 2013 and created EMDR Consulting and our approach, which is more of a neurological processing approach. And it uses a processing variable tool. Up until then, it was a one speed fits all. And now we have this variable tool that we offer, which is really valuable for those complex clients who can't do the full powered thing. They have to be titrated down. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the journey. And through that journey, have invited you, Crystal. I was as one of the trainers that we have in building our organization and meeting the demand we have to provide those trainings.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, Roy. I think it's 10 years this year that I met you when I brought you up to South Bend to do your belief-focused advanced workshop. And then when I asked you to come back and do the basic, you asked me to be a coach, a facilitator, and then within a couple years or less, a trainer. So I've known you 10 years now, which is hard to believe, but
I know. Yes. Time flies when we're having fun, doesn't it?
so much fun. Okay, Bruce, welcome. Thanks so much for coming here too. And I don't even know your background story about how you came to EMDR and what your journey was there, Bruce.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks, Roy, for that. Mine, it really a lot different. Just back in the late 90s, I'd read things about EMDR. It sounded, really powerful and exciting. And so, I was very motivated to go get some state of the art, cutting edge trauma treatment. So I always found myself exploring and traveling to get hypnosis trainings and EMDR and different things like that. So it was one of those things, and I was really fascinated with it. And I got my level 1 and level 2 trainings within a couple of years of each other, like 96 and 98 or something like that. And I found that there was just such tremendous variability in the outcomes that I was getting. Sometimes it was just like fabulous. This is just amazing, and then sometimes disastrous. Uh, and so I kind of backed off from EMDR, but I was always very very curious about what is it about EMDR that really makes it work? Why does it work so well when it works, and what's going wrong when it doesn't? And I didn't find my way back into the EMDR world for consultation to become certified, and then soon afterward a consultant until like probably 8 or 10 years later, like and it was around the same time that I was getting interested in IFS. I had discovered IFS, and then what happened for me was that the two just kind of instantly became attached to one another. In that IFS was a way for me to make sense of EMDR. As well as some other things. It kind of resonated with a lot of other things that I had learned, and added more to it. But it became a kind of a way of understanding a lot of things, including EMDR. And I thought it would be really really helpful to introduce IFS to the EMDR world, because it was helping me to make so much sense of things. That's my, and so then I just stayed. I kept a kind of a presence in the EMDR world, but it's always been kind of along with the IFS. So that's been my EMDR journey.
Yeah. Okay. And I've known you about 2 years now. So thanks for that. When I really felt like when I started doing consultation with you, Bruce, it was like, I felt like I was learning something new for the first time in a long time, because I've been doing EMDR for so long and
Yeah.
teaching Roy's model. So I was really comfortable with that. And then it was like bringing this IFS upgrade to my work just really helped me bloom with my own clients. And one of the things I've noticed that you two have a similarity on, at least in the models that you teach and work with, seems to be a foundation or some sort of drawback to Bruce Ecker's work and Robin Tickick's work in unlocking the emotional brain, or coherence therapy, which I didn't know had an actual word to it until Bruce taught me that's coherence therapy. But both of you seem to have some kind of bubbling up from that. And I wonder if either of you, whoever wants to start, would be willing to talk a little bit about how that's informed your EMDR work as a clinician and also as a teacher. And
Well, I'm going to defer to Roy on that. Just, your turn. But also, I think you happened into that before I did, and I think it was kind of shaping some of your ideas before I even really got on board with it.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think dating back into probably more than 10 years ago, I started to realize that in EMDR, the primary model is we process targets. And you pick a target, and then you start off, and Francine would teach me, this is how you hold your hand. And once you start processing, you have these channels of association that come out of that target. And that was the original model. And when I teach, I often bring up one of the first times that alerted me that that's problematic was with a woman who had some issues with what she thought was a phobia on a bus. And the negative cognition was I'm powerless, and the emotions that went with that were shame. And then at that time, I wasn't using anything but this power tool. So we started processing that. And over the course of the number of sets, as she started to unfold that narrative about what was happening on the bus, it got to the point where, and she was a child, the memory that we floated back to was something that happened when she was 10, related to a bus. And at one point, she started reflecting that she was getting very sick and felt very powerless and trapped because she was starting to get nauseous and her colleagues were watching her. And then you say, go with that. And then the next set was an associated channel of my parents used to go out a lot. Go with that. We used to have babysitters. Go with that. There was a babysitter I didn't like. Go with that. I'm having images of a bedroom. And then suddenly I still remember, probably relatively politely said, stop, thank you very much, and left, essentially, because we weren't processing a target. We were processing a network of something that was related, which led me to say that we process the cognition initially in the original conceptualization. We have to have some way of organizing this plan so that we don't have these surprises. And in trainings, one of the biggest pushbacks of newly trained clinicians is that spontaneous surprise, where suddenly I think I'm in this place and I'm in an entirely different place. And so the connecting seemed to be the cognition. If we tracked down the powerless and said, tell me other times you have felt powerless, then we would have identified other events, which would have then given us this outline of when I use my forearms, I represent kind of a neural network. So the neural network concept started to really crystallize in the 2008, 9, 10, and the workshop I did with Crystal was building around that. We process neural networks as opposed to individual targets, and the best way to identify that is through language of what the feelings and emotions are. So that was the onset of that process. And I've always been also one of those that says one of the other issues initially with processing and the standard model is you desensitize this thing and then you put this new thing in as though it never existed, the positive cognition, and you just install that. And I think I came out of probably positive psychology and resourcing even before I started EMDR to realize there's this other system going on too, that there is this positive belief. And when we think about that, we're really working with two systems. And I think that's where Bruce Eckert's material came in really clear about identifying these two neural networks. And he started really articulating that very well and very simply, that you bring up the negative thought and you embellish it, you bring up your preferred thought, your cognitive distortion, and then you get that juxtaposition that pulls, there's an automatic energy to start moving those and consolidating them into one. So that was where I think I saw these, it really helped me articulate that process of neural networks and neural network consolidation. Now, I would say, they talk about reconsolidation and memory erasing. I'm more of the opinion that we consolidate memory networks and we blend them into one, mixing strawberries with some lemonade in a blender, you get strawberry lemonade, but you don't erase the strawberries. It's all part of your life. It's just distilled differently. So I think that's how I've taken Eckert's initial model that's more of a, explains that cognitive distortion and integrated it into neural network processing as defined by the core beliefs. That's probably moved our training model or our approach into that perspective. So it really does bring up very expertly, identify it, create that juxtaposition and stimulate it to integrate it, which I think is very simply stated with Eckert's work in different models, including his cohesive therapy. And also the fact that he, strengthened that the more experiential the events, the better the integration.
Yes.
Mixing that blender, otherwise it just falls back to its homeostasis.
Yeah.
You don't work on it. So I think EMDR and I think internal family systems and Gestalt and those that really pull in everything are going to accomplish that integration.
Yeah, that's a beautiful summary, Roy. That's really great. And I know that Bruce Hersey's work brings some of Eckert's work in too, but from a different flavor, different model with internal family systems. How would you add to that, Bruce?
Yeah, well, that was really interesting, and it makes so much sense what the way that you describe that evolution, Roy. That you helped the EMDR kind of move forward there with that from a sense of an event as the target to the network is the target, and so then I say the part the network is a part, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And so that's sort of my next step in that evolution. But as far as coherence therapy goes, uh, my path is similar to the EMDR path, where something comes like knocking, and I might pay some attention to it and then wander away, and then it knocks again, and I go, oh, okay, I think I saw this or heard this before, and then I walk away, and then the third time I go, I better pay attention to this. So coherence therapy came to me in that way. I already knew, learned EMDR. I already learned IFS. I was already working on integrating those two things, or at least using IFS as a way to understand and troubleshoot EMDR, but focused, really more deeply focused on IFS. And somebody who was a trainee consultee said, hey, you ought to check out this, unlocking the emotional brain. There's a lot of things in here that resonate with IFS. Let me share an article with you. So I read the article and it was like, yeah, okay, I can see there's a little connection there, and that was it for that. And then I think they came back around. I encountered the same person, or they reminded me of that, and I read a little more, and again, just kind of very cursory. And then I was invited to. Someone had recommended me to a fellow who teaches IFS and was teaching coherence therapy in Australia. So he actually is the guy, Simon Dorsonia, was bringing IFS training into Australia, and he was inviting me to bring IFS informed EMDR to Australia. So I thought, oh, that's a great idea. I'll go to Australia. But before I ever got there, he said, you ought to check out this coherence therapy. So I was like, okay, I'm going to check it out. So I really checked it out. And before I ever got to Australia, then I was already starting to integrate that into the IFS and the EMDR, because what I was seeing was that the like Roy is, that the network, the target network is kind of organized by some learning, negative learning, so a negative conclusion, or something like that, and so it's got this schema. But also what I was seeing, and I'm not sure even Simon was seeing it yet, and I haven't really talked to him about this specifically, but I'm seeing the positive cognition as really something that the person, their self, capital S, already believes, already knows is true. It isn't just a true fact. It isn't just something that happens to be true, but it's actually something that somewhere in their system, the person really does know experientially. They really deep down just know that it's true.
The adaptive network already in
The
place.
adaptive network, yeah. And so that what's happening is, in this encounter between that self, relationally, between that self and this part, that it also represents the dysfunctional network, or the target network. There's a relationship between them, and there's this acceptance by the self that, even though I know this to be true, I can also understand why you have come to believe this is true, even though that's not what I believe. But there's no effort to change this. Just bringing those two together in this dual awareness creates the juxtaposition. and that's so foundational in IFS, and that's so foundational in EMDR, and it's foundational in coherence therapy. So like all these three approaches are just kind of lining up, right there in this kind of dual attention place. And it just felt like such a beautiful synchrony. And so I'm just been trying to articulate, how do we find that? How do we get to those places and bring those things together? And the three different understandings kind of have a little bit of their own way to kind of nudge us, into that dual attention, that juxtaposition, and that natural healing that takes place.
Yeah, awesome. This is so fun to hear both of you just talk about that. That's beautiful. So one of the most common questions I get in consultations that I think goes with both of those conversations that you were just having is this concept of maybe the positive network, the adaptive network, or the self, capital S self in IFS, that juxtaposition experience. A lot of us who work with complex trauma, really dissociative clients, things like that, have a hard time accessing that in some of those clients. And so I guess my simple question would be, how do you maybe personally in your own lives access that sense of self or adaptive positive network? How do you do it with your clients? How do you bring it to your teaching? Anything you'd want to say about that adaptive or self piece?
And Bruce, you can go first this time. Well,
Yeah. So when I'm lucky enough to do that,
Yes.
when I'm lucky enough to do that, I think it just starts with an awareness of what is there that is somehow diminishing that, or
What's taking away from it rather than
yeah,
okay,
yeah, and so that
not in it.
right.
Mhm.
Right. And so, it's sort of paradoxical that, kind of focusing on what is in the way of it, or what is not it, kind of brings you closer to that space, because I think it begins to set up that dual awareness.
Uh-huh.
Otherwise, we're in IFS terms blended, and if we're really blended, as blended as we can be, then we don't know that we're blended. We don't know, that there's a part, that's kind of that whose eyes we're looking through, and whose experience we're experiencing the world through. So as we become aware of that, or as I become aware of that, that's when I start to get a foothold outside of that, and it starts the process of dual awareness for me, which equals the dual awareness equals self-presence, equals some other things. There's some other words that I like to use that are parallel to that come from other areas of learning. So one is intersubjectivity. There's that we have a sense of being in 1 foot over here, 1 foot over there, but also being able to experience empathically the point of view, or the feeling, of the other position simultaneously. So we're like once two consciousnesses, and then there's another word, and it's allocentric, which is a word that comes from navigation, cognitive mapping, which is kind of a counterpoint to egocentric. So egocentric meaning that you can really only perceive the world, or your map, from one position on that map. There's only one perspective. And allocentric is this ability to have this map where you can place yourself anywhere in that map and have, another perspective in addition to wherever you actually are, on that map simultaneously. So those two words are kind of helpful also conceptually to me to kind of fill out this idea of self-presence. All of those things are forms of dual awareness.
Yeah. Oh, I just learned something. Allocentric. I've not thought of it that way, the way you described it, and that psychological distance, that observing, that ability to get some space, as we would say in IFS, and
Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, just FYI, in terms of what's the mechanism of action of EMDR, we know that somehow PTSD or chronic PTSD does some kind of hippocampal damage. So we know that it shrinks, the volume of the hippocampus shrinks from chronic PTSD. And what I know just from reading about cognitive mapping is that the hippocampus is required for allocentric mapping. So when animals and humans are hippocampally impaired, they're also impaired in terms of tasks that require allocentric mapping. Interesting, interesting note there. So to me, that implicates somehow the hippocampus might be involved in the mechanism of action of EMDR, because what's happening, when we do bilateral stimulation and we set up, dual awareness, those two things are kind of critical components of the process of EMDR. But what if those things are somehow stimulating the hippocampus, like kickstarting it, jump-starting it or something,
I definitely want to get to that and both of your thoughts on mechanism of action, because I think you both have some similar and different thoughts. But Roy, I wanted to hear from you about adaptive, positive self for yourself, for clients. Yeah.
Well, I think our accessing that self, if I'm starting to learn the IFS kind of language, is dependent upon how noisy and loud the negative is. And I think what we see a lot of times in EMDR and the very successful, easy treatment processes, going back to my analogy of the two arms representing neural networks, when we have a very high functioning client who is having an anomaly of some distractor that may not be PTSD, but it's an adjustment disorder, we have a very positive neural network. And then under some situations, this system gets activated and it dominates. And so a lot of way I will look at neural networks is kind of a transition or a growth from the original model of a frozen memory network, as in PTSD, which implies that the adaptive system within that memory is not working. It's locked down and it doesn't work. And that could be with the simple client, which Francine started with, single incident traumas. It's frozen and unable to connect with what is already existing as a very adaptive functional network. I know I'm adequate. I know I'm safe. I know this. And so by the EMDR processing, we can access these two systems, and this natural tendency is to integrate. However, I think most of our clients come in with what I teach is an isolated neural network. And isolated neural networks are an accumulation over time of that part. As Bruce has said, it's this part who has repeatedly been exposed to, I'm not good enough. And over the course of my growing up in a family system, I'm constantly bombarded by maybe just the small little Chinese cuts over a long period of time, where I get very good at not being good enough. And one of the illustrations in the training I refer to is that movie Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray started off very dysfunctionally, but was able to modify and adapt within a closed system to continue to try to evolve. So when we look at neural networks from that perspective, we see this reoccurring system where the adaptive system is working, but it's being encoded at a level that is not able to access and connect up with what is also happening. I think many times our clients experience these negative experiences and have the negative beliefs in an interpersonal environment, primarily generated and originating with the family, primarily your parents, and then your family, your extended family. And then they develop this other system in business, in school. They have coaches and mentors that has a different energetic encoding. So we have these two different systems that are occurring, and primarily we are functioning, depending upon the complexity of the client, we're functioning from this adaptive system, the more highly functioning, where I know I'm adequate, I know I'm good enough, I know I have value, whatever. And then occasionally something triggers this other system. And I really like Francine's the past is present. And I think we use that as our opening gambit in therapy. Why are you here? I feel this way when my partner walks away from me, or I feel this way. And then we start to find the language or the part and say, okay, let's find out history to that part. And then we start to see these two systems. So I think with the highly functional client, we have a really well-established system, and this is the anomaly. Mm-hmm. This is that distortion. I know it, but I don't feel it. Mm-hmm. And so the feeling part then falls into how was it encoded and how intensely was it encoded. And one of the theories that we go by is the more intense the symptoms are now suggests the earlier and the more intense the initial encoding. So one of the videos that we like to show, you can get off YouTube, is ultronic still face videos, where the mother just has that still face and the baby totally gets dysregulated. If that were ongoing and pervasive, then I might have a client who comes in terrified of abandonment and gets into panic attacks or whatever when their partner starts to leave, which is a remanifestation of the system being activated. So part of our interviewing of the self and this part is how well can you access this under normal situations, and then also how much is it masked and blinded under other activation systems. So many times when we talk about in the EMDR language, the level of disturbance, the negative, and then we have the validity of the cognition of the positive, we're measuring during the actual accessing and activating that target. When you think of the negative, what's the positive and how true does it feel? A couple of ways I explain what we're measuring, one of which is the negative system really, when it's activated, dominates and overwhelms the positive system. You can have, one of the terms we use as amygdala hijacking. The amygdala has encoded this parts, emotions at a very high level, and it will hijack what I know to be true. Or another analogy I use is emotional vertigo. I default to this feeling sensation, although I cognitively know the other. So in EMDR language, when we do the VOC, one of the illustrations I use is when we have this positive network and we pull up the negative, we're actually masking what you actually can access. So when we say, what's your validity of a cognition? It's a 2. I can only see this much of my neural network because of the noise of that negative part, that negative cognition, that negative belief is there. And then that also explains what we see in processing, which one analogy is as we go through desensitization, there's greater and greater access to the positive system. So when this event finally gets to 0, I now have almost complete access to that which has already been there.
Yes.
So I think we're both in concert with that from that perspective. So when you are identifying the complex client, then you have a client with a pervasive negative neural network, and oftentimes a very anemic, underdeveloped positive neural network, which easily would be overwhelmed if we just start to do unrestricted processing. Mm-hmm. And so now that's the challenge where I think both of these approaches says, wait a minute, let's start looking at this and try to keep this offline and allow you to get into your hippocampal activity. And I think as you were talking about this, Bruce, it occurred to me that this is where the polyvagal theory might weave very nicely, where we want the client to be in that rest and digest, the parasympathetic system, to be able to access the hippocampus. to be able to access that dual awareness of these two systems. And part of our whole process is to keep that regulated, modulate that so that they don't get into that hippocampal shutdown or the amygdala hijacking, so that they can have that dual awareness, that they can say, I know this and I can observe that other part, as opposed to I feel this and I'm living this and I can't see or even experience this because this system is so noisy. I don't even have an awareness. I think another analogy I often use is really, really loud, disturbing music playing in the background, and that's all you can hear. But as you turn the volume down of that music, suddenly you hear a very pleasant music that's been playing all the time. But the noise has been so intense from that negative part or that negative belief that it's dominating and overwhelming the client, at least in some situations. And then again, our task is when you identify a client who has a pervasive negative system, it begs us, we have to spend time building this system up. And that's where sometimes early in treatment, prior to processing, it's important to spend some time building up that positive system, that part, and keeping that other self, the self up, and keep the part offline, and build the self and point out, wait a minute, you have it here, you have it here, you have it here. And I think also, as we're talking about this, one of the traps that clinicians have, particularly trauma-based clinicians, is to minimize this side. And I often talk about in the EMDR community, I often bring up the question to my participants or my training team, of these two systems, which is the one that's most important to identify? And I would suggest that most people trained in the traditional model are going to say the negative. We got to have that defined. We have to know that part really well. And the reality is, to me, we want to know the self really well, because integration is that assimilation and that blending into that which is already there, keeping what was important from this system and letting go of those other no longer necessary pieces of that negative system. So when we look at that, here again, overlaying it with Eckert's work, identifying those neural networks, and when this positive is underdeveloped, spend the time identifying that, turning it on, listing it up. And, yeah, Crystal, you mentioned earlier that these belief-focused workshops I was doing 10 years ago. I remember doing a training with very, very highly trained clinicians who had never used the belief process experience. And they reported how much more efficient processing was, because we had spent time defining where you're going, not where you've been. And I think referencing another colleague down in Australia, Graham Taylor, has done some studies where he has actually, after they developed a targeting plan, he spent 4 or 5, remind me of 4 or 5 incidents when you have experienced a positive belief. And he's done pre and post measurements. And by doing that, he lowers the level of disturbance by 2 on average, and increases the VOC by 2 just by doing that exercise. So that again points out this foundational thing we're both referring to with Bruce Eckert's work of this juxtaposition. And the more I know this is true, the more the brain is going to start moving towards it.
I met Graham.
Oh, okay.
He came to my workshop.
Yeah, Graham's a great guy. Just love him. You just see, and he's very much in that same modality, very adaptive and flexible, and does a lot with resourcing and building too. Yeah.
Anything that you wanted to respond to there, Bruce, that sparked anything, or should we go into my next topic?
Next topic, or I don't know, because the topic you might have raised like a complex topic here in this one, and I have a part that's sort of thinking, did I answer
You did
the whole thing? Because I think you were talking, you mentioned something about complex clients, so I don't know if I know Roy did answer that, but I'm not sure. What was the question pertaining to?
Well, it's how to access, essentially in IFS language, how to access more self energy, or how to access more of that positive network when they have such an underdeveloped
Oh, so I did not answer that. I don't think I answered because I thought part of that, the other part was how do I do it
Yeah,
in me,
it
in me.
was. It was.
So
And I thought you
okay,
answered that well. So
yes, I answered that part, but not, with the client who is not as fortunate as I am, and maybe doesn't have so much access to that self. In which case, I how I view it is sort of I'm inverting the system now, and I'm looking at parts as holograms. So, in other words, that each part, um, because IFS has this tenet belief that all parts have positive intention. So I interpret that as all parts have some self energy in it within them. There's some kind of self within the part, as disturbed as they might be, somewhere in that part itself. There's some kind of self energy. Now, we might not see that right away. But if we can spend time with the part, so it's a little martial arts ish. Right? I'm going in deep into the part, and deep understanding of that part enables that part to feel unchallenged. You're not trying to change me. You're not trying to,
get
you
rid of
know,
it.
get rid of me, disempower me, or whatever. You're accepting what I believe, and you're actually interested. And so the part ultimately relaxes, which is some amount of desensitization in itself. But then we find, more qualities of self as we spend more time with that part, and we also understand more and more deeply the actual positive intention of the part. And this is where it also then parallels with coherence therapy, in that we're doing this coherence, having this coherence empathy. We're not taking an anti-symptom approach to it. We're finding the pro-symptom schema. What is, why does it have to be this way? And it begins to make more and more sense, to a point where you, as you're listening and making sense of it, are able to actually articulate the sense of it. And so we can kind of mirror back to the part who's still blended. So you have to be this way. It's necessary to believe this or act this way or feel this way, because if you didn't, here's what would happen. And if we can articulate that in a way that makes sense to us, and the part can resonate, then a shift is happening. And there's also more potential awareness from the perspective of that part, of the other voices in the system. So even that tiny voice of distant voice of self, maybe there's a more awareness, like the noise is going down, as Roy would say. So the part, is still playing its music, but the volume's going down and the volume's going down, and it can start to hear other musics, in different places, and it's not so bothered by those other musics, and more.
Think they don't have to keep screaming because you've got it. It's like
Yeah,
they don't have to keep screaming it because
yeah,
you got it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess that's at least a start at answering what you were asking about there.
Yeah. And let me, I guess, answer the other part of the question that I didn't answer about, how would one access this? I think the awareness that it's there is a really valuable piece. Okay, when such and such happens, I know where this comes from. I know this goes back to this or this, and having the awareness that it's an old experience. It was a learned behavior that was necessary and adapted from that part, and I think to be able to step back and see that is allowing us to catch ourselves. And even we're all going to get triggered at some degree or another. And now in therapy, it's too big of a trigger we can't overcome. But just that insight that, wait a minute, this goes back to such and such. And oftentimes the initial phases of treatment is to point that out. And I think the other part that Bruce was talking about, where I think IFS would be really elegant and terrific in the EMDR aspect, is in lowering this noise, which also allows the person to have greater access to this. And a lot of that comes from attunement and attachment and validation. And when we talk about attachment in therapy and in EMDR, many times our clients come in with a real void of that. I've had to scream it. I've had to yank on your legs to remind you I'm here, just for me to survive. And now we are modeling a parent who is validating and nurturing and supporting, and allowing that part to have a voice, and to also know that it's not, it can survive and it's connected. And so I think oftentimes in the EMDR kind of continuum, where the IFS is really going to be a very valuable, is that phase of history gathering where we're establishing rapport, but we're also starting to identify that juxtaposition, nurturing it, and having this part be willing to acknowledge self, and self to be able to acknowledge that part, to separate out and to start to observe the two, so that we can develop that whole outline neural network of the negative experiences, and recognize they're all being triggered by the same paradigm, and which you can start to work on catching yourself. In couples therapy, it's not your partner, it's how you're perceiving that, and it's sort of that emotional hijacking. So I think that whole dance that really is what I'm hearing about IFS, is that piece that expands and embellishes and nurtures the self or the part, and simultaneously is allowing self to have awareness of the part and acknowledge it and recognize it. And that sets the stage for this juxtaposition, which automatically, and I'm sure, Bruce, you've experienced just that work you've done, where integration occurs without bilateral stimulation. It's that natural pull towards integration. And coherence therapy has that, Gestalt, we have all these variations of all of which are designed to activate this adaptive system that allows the hippocampus to be online, allows this whole system to update. So I think that's where they marry in so beautifully, as I'm hearing that time spent and the strategies that you're teaching that acknowledge and validate and affirm. And I'm sure, Crystal, you're our bridge that can probably say this is how that matches together.
Yeah, before I knew IFS or EMDR for that matter, I used, way back in community mental health days, I used to have this thing I would say to my clients. I don't know where I got it, but I would say it's the 3 A's. What we do in therapy is the 3 A's. We do awareness first, then acceptance, then action. And we can't do action first, really. We have to do awareness, acceptance, action. And actually, just what we're doing in this interview right now is kind of where we just talked about awareness. We started to talk about
you didn't need all this.
I had the theory there. I just didn't have the mechanism. So now let's talk about the mechanism if we can, because this is fun. Thinking about bilateral stimulation in EMDR and what it does. And Bruce, I know you've talked about working memory is not your favorite version of the theories, and Roy has some other ideas too. So who would want to talk about what does that bilateral stimulation do? What's the action of the process and the therapies that we do here? What's happening there? What do you think?
Well, I already dipped my toe in it a little bit, but I'm happy to let Roy speak some to that, and then I can come back to add on to whatever I started with there.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think obviously the initial was bilateral hemispheric interaction between left and right hemispheres. And then the REM was sort of the next layer of supporting that from Strickhold's work with the rapid eye movements and that natural tendency to problem solve, through our REM phases of sleep. So I think that's still, as a foundation, well within the structure. The next, I think, evolution was the orientating response that we know, what do you notice now? Go with that, and modulating back and forth between being involved and then being self, and then go back into this blending and then being self again. And I remember Francine always pointing out those who just hold buzzers and talk for an hour really are missing that modulation back and forth. And then the whole aspect of the dual attention came up, and I actually would rather call it distracting attention rather than dual. That what I understand that theory is that the brain cannot do two things simultaneously. And if we bring up an event and then distract ourselves from it, the automatic updating process occurs at a nanosecond. It occurs, it updates whatever was on that slide or that template updates. So what I've been in trying to reconcile what happens in the EMDR from that paradigm, what comes to my mind are the old cartoon cells. When you watch the animators, they would draw a cell and then they would turn a page and they would move one little piece of that cartoon character, and they would just keep doing that, coming from my Disney background, of course. And so when you see something in processing, if we go on the assumption that the brain will automatically update, you think about something and you stop thinking about it, there's an automatic updating, almost like your computer automatically autosaves. Then what seems to be happening in processing, if you go around with the distracting aspect, is that I pull up this incident, this image, or whatever it is, and then I get distracted by stimulation for a nanosecond, and then I come back to the image, and then I get distracted. So you have kind of the each cell gets kind of looked at and then assimilated, and then the next cell comes up, and the brain is vibrating back and forth or isolating back and forth at 100 cycles per second. And each time they do that, there's that instantaneous little kind of update. There's one of the videos we have has a woman says it feels like sheets of paper just going by. Or in processing, you've had clients say, I got it, then I lost it.
Yeah.
And so it explains that process that can be that back and forth and that cell by cell by cell moving. And sometimes the cell might have a feeling in it. Sometimes it might just change the picture. Each cell might have something different. And we might have a series of those, and then it changes to something else. So if you take that into consideration, then the other aspect that would support that is that the research being that the stimulation lowers vividnesses of images and lowers emotions. So if you go back to this metaphor of lowering the distractors, then by the time we finish processing, we have been able to more accurately clearly see the self, using your IFS terms. Or another analogy I've used is the fog. When you start off, the fog is so heavy you could barely make out what's there in the fog. But as the fog lifts with all these cells being changed, you then have access to the positive system, which I think allows clinicians during processing to have more flexibility of interpreting what's happening. So often the newly trained clinician is, oh, wait, they're starting to talk about positive things. They've gone to installation. I should stop and pull them back. And from a network, no, they're just moving stuff and it's assimilating, let them go there, and then it comes back to the other side. So it has a broader expansion. So I've tried to use all of them as not that there's not one over the other, because so often clinicians get tied up with bilateral stimulation or what if they can't do that? And we know that other things work too. Particularly when we're teaching children, you can do dancing, singing. I've done some crisis work where they've gone into third world countries. I said, just let them draw it in the ground and dance their ritual dances. It will process because you create that distractor, that disruption. So all of those are ways to present the same material. I think also, again, having the hippocampus online and the amygdala kind of offline goes back to that modulating and having that parasympathetic system in place, keeping them within their window of tolerance so it doesn't shut down processing. So there's a whole collage of all of these kind of interplay out simultaneously.
Yeah, I haven't heard you use that cartoon one before, but immediately when you started talking about that, of course, I thought of Mickey, the old Mickey cartoon that does that. Yeah, and I know how much you love Mickey. So Bruce, I'd love to hear your response to Roy and your own, where you've come through this with IFS upgrade or how you.
Yeah. Well, I prefer simplicity. I'm trying to find, what unifies, all of these things that I know. What do they all have in common? And I try to distill, some kind of understanding from that. So what makes sense to me is what's unique about EMDR. There's a lot of stuff that's not unique about EMDR. But we have the 8 phases, and we do a lot of things that we would do in other therapies. But the two really distinct things is this dual attention and bilateral stimulation. So I'm looking at those things, and firstly, do those two things have anything in common? Well, when I learned about it, actually, Stickgold was the first person to mention the potential role of the hippocampus, because the hippocampus does actually two things. It has two jobs in the brain, and one is memory consolidation, and the other is this time and space mapping. So it kind of tells you, updates you at where you're at. Where are you in time and space, and it gives you the time stamp and the place stamp. And so if it's not really working right, then what's happening is the person is responding, even though maybe not in a conscious way, but unconsciously, they're reacting from a part who's stuck in some other time and place. The time and place aspect of the person's, behavioral response, orientation, is not, cohesive with what's the external reality of time and space. So I think that something is happening with the hippocampus. Now, what would so with dual attention, we're talking about having being in two places at once, having two different viewpoints, holding two different viewpoints at the same time. So if we're encouraging that, if we're supporting being in two places at once, having a one foot in the past and one foot in the present, having self-presence plus part activation, having disconfirming knowledge versus an implicit learning that produces symptoms, etc. A network, a target network versus the adaptive network. So we're encouraging a sorting of the attention in two different places, not as a distraction, but as a really, we really are encouraging you to have both of these perspectives, both of these viewpoints at the same time. To me, that requires hippocampal participation, in the project. Now, if we're talking about bilateral stimulation, we're talking about movement of an object in time and space. Whether that's a visual object that you're tracking from one side to the other, or whether that's an auditory object that you're tracking back and forth, or whether that's a kinesthetic or tactile object that you're tracking, it's moving. So some part of your brain is keeping track of that at the same time that we're encouraging dual attention. So we're doing two things at the same time that are encouraging hippocampal participation. Now we're doing a third thing, which Roy mentioned, which is, and that he referred to Francine talking about, which is what's different about running tappers and just talking versus going in, experiencing the inner experience, and coming out and talking about it. That is sequential dual attention, right? So pendulation, right? So we're doing yet a third thing that is requiring movement and position back and forth, different places. Three things now we're doing that are kind of encouraging. We're saying to the hippocampus, hey, get busy, go to work. So I don't see it as a distraction that somehow we're being distracted, or the working memory, some task is taking up part of our working memory, and so therefore, as a result, we're able to not get as upset. I really think that we're doing, and even in the context of, if we look at the procedure of EMDR from phase 1 into phase 2 and into phase 3, there's very deliberate things that we are supposed to do as EMDR therapists to create dual attention, to invite dual attention, and to ensure dual attention. So I really think it's, I'm pointing my finger at the hippocampus as the key thing that we're saying. We want to get this part of the brain active, because when it does, it's opening up the two things that the hippocampus does is exactly what we're wanting to happen. One, we want memory reconsolidation. What does the hippocampus do? Memory consolidation. Reconsolidation means doing it again. Undoing the consolidation that happened to some extent and redoing it. And then the other thing is, let's create an allocentric map. Let's be able to put ourselves in the appropriate time and place that matches external reality, instead of being stuck in this egocentric place where you never get out. You're always in that place. The bad thing, is continuing to happen to you. It never stopped. It's not over yet, so I guess that's how I'm passionate about that. You can see.
I love it.
Really.
And I'd never heard you say it that way, Bruce, about the moving the object, the bilateral eye, tactile, the moving of the object. And it made me think of that video. I don't know how long it's been out, and I can't remember the guy's name, so that's not very helpful, but it's on YouTube, where he talks about the visual flow, walking and thinking about something can create this visual flow. And that what you're talking about there, time, space, movement is
Sure.
some element there. So then that brings me to the body aspect of EMDR, which I think is my favorite part of EMDR. And how do you both, kind of see the body as important here, and bring it into your EMDR work and your EMDR teaching, and how can we get clinicians to do more of that?
Well, let me just start with that, because I would give credit to EMDR for helping me to recognize the importance of the body. I never, really, viewed it as all that important. It's like, okay, yeah, feelings, that kind of thing. But to really focus on that, and then there was some fella did a workshop. I lived in central Pennsylvania at the time. Now I'm in New Jersey, but I was in central Pennsylvania, which is quite far from Erie, and quite far from Pittsburgh, and quite far from Philly, quite far from anywhere else in Pennsylvania. So it was like a 4-hour trip or something to get to Erie. But I drove to Erie to do a 1 or 2 day, I think it might have been a 2-day workshop on the body. That was basically, it started from a standpoint of EMDR and why the body is so important. But what this fellow did was introduced somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, various other things. I think even Robert Scar was one of the authors that was referenced there. So a whole lot of just focus on all these different ways to really look at how the body is involved. And it was eye-opening for me. So I know, how important it is that way. And then, studied all those other different things to kind of enrich my knowledge of it. So I can say that about the importance of the body. It was EMDR that helped me realize that.
Yes. Anything you want to add, Roy, about the body or any of that?
Yeah, well, I think probably as a Gestaltist, I was doing it as part of a Gestalt aspect way back before neural networks and anything else was there. And as you reflect back, involving body movement is, of course, breaking the Gestalt, breaking the frozen freeze kind of experiences that people have. So I think that's, an aspect of it. And I think as Francine introduced the body, as I'm thinking about this, it's the best and the worst of the same world. It's a double-edged sword. We can use the body to access and be part of a traditional target plan or target. And to me, the somatic, the implicit memory system, which is primarily shown up through body sensations, is the umbilical cord to an entire neural network. And so I think it's important to have that and to process the full neural network. It's valuable to have that all move together as a system. And as much as the client is knowledgeable of it or not, it's a system that's moving regardless. And then it gets to be a tipping point where, well, back up, we can use the sensations, the emotions, the body sensations and put language to that, which is going to identify the negative core beliefs as in the parts that have the feelings and these body sensations that predate the present. So we can use it at that point as a map, the mapping out of experiences so that we get a better, clear idea of what's all neurologically connected. And then those are all really positive and aspects of what is valuable in EMDR. And then when you start to get on the more complex continuum, then you have other issues. Cycling way back to the beginning with very complex clients who cannot access it at all, there's going to be a shutdown of feelings and emotions, and it's going to block any processing. And many times, the part or the negative belief that I would generate out of that is it's not safe to feel. And there's that part that just can't do that. And the self that we would want to identify, or what I refer to as a positive belief, to me is a rather long, drawn out one, which is something in the order of I can begin to learn when, how much, and with whom I can start to be authentic, I can feel. So that would be, the system that can't do it at all, and the self that says, maybe I can sometimes under certain situations. So, that's where I think somatic experiencing has become very valuable. The emphasis on the body way back in structuring the client and getting their systems ready to process is where a lot of people, I think, have reached out with those complex clients saying, we've got to teach people to get in touch with their bodies and start to learn when and how much I can really do this so that there's a system here that we can build up. So I think going, cycling back to the complex client, that's an issue. Then in EMDR processing, where it can be problematic is when those body sensations have not been clearly identified and explored, and we start off with that emptiness in my stomach or this feeling I have, and we haven't been able to draw parallels of where that is involved, and doing the unrestricted processing, suddenly we're down in the rabbit hole because we've pulled up the feelings, emotions, that umbilical cord has taken us into intense feelings that we might not have associated with the event, as in my feelings of shame and this feeling in my body that's associated with me sitting in a bus suddenly goes somewhere else. So I think then the body needs to be managed, and that's where what we teach is this variable speed processing continuum, where wonderful if we can do EMDR, but many complex clients need to really go back to EMD, and we've kind of come full circle, in my opinion, where Francine started with EMD and then she discarded it for this other model. And now we're saying, wait a minute, with really complex clients, you've got to shut the system down and you've got to manage that system to the extent with really complex clients of not even involving the body. And when we set up, one of the differences in how we look at EMD and how Francine looks at it, or how it's written in her literature or trained, is in phase 3, they still bring up where is it located in the body. And we teach when we're doing the more restrictive form of EMD is we don't even bring the body online because that's just a trap. That's going to potentially open up the system that could create, havoc, along with, shorter sets of stimulation, more directive interactions to get that aspect. So I think it's the awareness of it, the value of it, the potential power of it, and the potential power of it. And sometimes we can't let that client go there yet.
Yes.
With that client who really has all this. Now we teach them how to be more comfortable with it, and we can build them up with resource activities about getting in touch with the feelings, while we're also maybe nibbling away at the intensity of this system to try to shrink it a little bit, while we're simultaneously giving you a little bit more access to your positive with each intervention, so that at some point we get to a tipping point where we can then say, okay, let's go with the whole enchilada here. Let's open it up and let you clean out that whole system, because we know that the body is probably implicit memory, that's memory system. It's a measurement of that. We know it's not consciously stored. We know it's not consciously activated. So we want to have that continuum of it's great, it's important, and then it's also really powerful, and it can be really powerful. And to have that ability to say, wait, we're going to purposely leave this out of the system for a while, is, I think, that's the other end of the continuum. So there's options in various places where we think about the value of it and the importance of it, and I have to help you tolerate it and learn it to have it there to strengthen it. And I can also simultaneously be teaching, doing some somatic experiencing work and other work while we're starting to do essentially desensitization with EMD to nibble away at your system and have those happen concurrently, to where you lower the fears and the anxiety while you're building up the ability to tolerate, to where finally they get to where in concert where you can then say, okay, let's start to maybe open up even more processing. And again, in that continuum of really complex clients, that might take quite a bit of time. A lot of the trainings that we do, as you know, with community mental health agency settings, we say you may not get to open-ended EMDR for months, if at all, with some of your clients, because they have so much other stuff that they have to have in place before you do it. So I think there's that awareness of it and the power of it, and then the options and choices of understanding. We don't just go after everybody should feel, let's go for a feeling, when it would overwhelm and cascade a person into the abyss. Is that awareness of how we manage it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which, both of you are very focused on client-centered work, being client-centered in a safe and, of course, evidence-based, but also safe ways to keep our clients' needs in mind, and each person being very different, and each system of each client being very different. And so we can't just apply this one size fits all the time, which is one of the reasons I respect both of your work so much, because it brings that into play. So I really appreciate that. We can't just go blasting around doing EMDR perfectly with every person by the standard way it was written. It's just not every client is built for that. Even though that's kind of the way I was taught originally. It's just not true. So I really appreciate both of your client focused, client centered, person, human first approaches to this work. So what else? Anything else that you guys would want to make sure and mention and talk about in this time? It's been so rich and valuable, I think.
I'll just take off on the point of EMD, which sort of I see as a fractionation or a titration. And there's so many different ways to do it. I know the flash technique is one, very new way of fractionating a target when it appears that whatever target we might otherwise have is just daunting and overwhelming to the client. And so just using the example of the client who, may be phobic of the body, or not able to feel anything in the body, and if we are an EMDR therapist who has to get that component of the target we're going to meet up with, really what I would call from an IFS perspective, a protector whose implicit learning is exactly what Roy described before, is it's not safe for me to be in my body.
That's right.
So here we're kind of locking horns with that part, which is in place to protect the person, because this part has learned that that's not safe, right? So a different way of fractionating the target would be to actually make that part the target. So that part who is the protector, then who has that learning that it's not safe to be in my body, can be the target. So a different way of fractionating. And Jim Knipe, is one of the ones who went in that direction, and he talked about how desensitizing the defense is an indirect way to desensitize the trauma. And so I always thought that was just brilliant, that we don't have to look at it as kind of diverting, going in some different direction, that we're actually still going in the direction that we want to desensitize this target, and the system is giving us the place where we can do that. So this is an IFS fractionation, an IFS titration. I do it a little bit differently from Jim Knight, because I don't see it as desensitization per se. I view the desensitization as a kind of a byproduct of actually getting to know that protector. So when we're actually titrating and fractionating the goal, and we're separating out desensitization, and we're saying, no, this is just understanding. We want to understand this part that says it's not safe to be in the body. So can we get other typical target elements, like a visual, and we have a cognition here. It's not safe for me to be in my body, right? Or something along those lines. So we have this cognition. Maybe we can get a little more information about the cognition, which I call the protector positive intention. And what that means is that rather than viewing this as a negative cognition, we could view it as a positive intention. I need to not feel things in my body, because if I did, this bad thing would happen. So we can look at that as a positive intention. I have to do this. It's necessary. And here's the reason, why. There's a problem and a solution. The solution is obvious, is what I'm doing, right? What I have to do. The problem may be a little more obscure, but we might get a little information about that by asking this blended part. So what would happen if you did get in touch with your body, if you did feel things, I would be in, tremendous pain. I would go crazy, or I would, have to commit suicide or something. You would get that next worst thing. And so then we can see why, okay, this is a positive intention then. It has to do this, where this bad thing would happen. And since there's no feeling in the body that goes along with this, the no feeling is the feeling, that checks that box, in the, target element, checkbox. What was there? So we have the cognition, we have the no body sensation. Is there an image? Is there a, picture that comes to mind? So we can collect this, target element data. I avoid the positive cognition, And I avoid the VOC because I'm not getting a positive cognition, because I feel that I want the positive cognition to come from the self. And so we're assuming this part is blended, self isn't here. We're not going to get a positive cognition from a blended part. And we're just going to have this contract then that defines this very fractionated process. So yeah, so I just like the idea of different ways to fractionate targets, because we're receiving the information from the system. It's telling us this much is too much. So we say, okay, well, we can find a way to make it this much, and we can be creative about that. We can do it, with EMD, we can do it with flash technique, we can do it in an IFS kind of way. There's, I'm sure many other ways.
Yeah, really, really true. Mm-hmm.
Well, and as I was listening to that, Bruce, I'm thinking now, if somebody were to attend my training from an IFS and said, "Now, Roy, what do you do with, what language would you use, or how would you frame the positive intention when I'm saying positive adaptive beliefs?" And it occurred to me that I would probably say, well, maybe not be a negative, but I might reframe it into a necessary.
Yeah.
It's necessary for survival. It was necessary.
Yeah.
And it was necessary then. And like you said, I had to do it. I have to do it to survive. If I cry or feel, I have a great video of a woman who said, my mother had a severe anxiety disorder. So it was necessary for me not to feel, because I would dysregulate. I had to protect me. Because the way I protect me is to make sure my mother doesn't get dysregulated so she can protect me. So then it becomes a necessary learned skill. And from our model, the more strongly it's entrenched, the stronger the encoding was initially, which means the stronger it had to do it to survive. Like you said, the stronger that part is, that protector, it can get to that life or death energy. And we feel that so often with that really dramatic client. It's like, I have to do this to survive. And I'm sure you feel it. And that slow little piece. I also, just as we're talking about the flash, to give you one of the ways I kind of explain it, again, from this neural network perspective, and the hippocampal and the shutting down. My understanding, of flash, when Phil says, you can run your finger through a flame and you just don't feel it because it's such a small little linkage. So often what I've said is, if we were to set up the fear of feeling, and I would probably, from this flash approach, be around the beliefs perspective, I'd say, bring up, I can do this. I can sometimes do it. And then when I move my finger across, I might say blink or shutter or snap or something. And I might say, it's like a shutter speed of a camera at 1,000th of a second. You still get a picture. And so, that one opening allows 20,000 neurotransmitters to connect with that one system for a nanosecond, so that the hippocampus can stay online. Because if you spend too much time, it gets shut down because you have that amygdala hijacking. So it's a nice way to put into, again, I think we're giving, I hope everybody gets no advertising here, but Eckert's book is a wonderful way to look at this. And we can start to see all the things we're doing with that. And I think the other thing that we're both emphasizing is, there's so many ways you can use EMDR within an over context of therapy. And it's not the treatment. It's one of many tools. And IFS is a tool, and internal family system, and somatic experiencing. All these are tools that we use with a greater or lesser degree, or come in surgically, just do that one little EMD with that part, like you said, and then back out and do other work. Is, I think, one of the messages that we want to continue to emphasize in our community, that it's not just this narrow box. It's all encompassing. At least for me, I can't put all the forms of therapy into the 8 phases. I can't do that. I'm going to use EMDR when I want to do EMDR, and I'll do Gestalt, and I'll do IFSS, and I blend them all and intermix them. in a very creative mixture, as opposed to I'm only doing this or I'm only doing that. And I'm hearing you say that too, Bruce. It's like, let's go in and how do we do it and what parts can we use in the EMDR aspect that will integrate with IFS, and what IFS stuff can we put in with EMDR, and it really blends itself very seamlessly.
Well, I've had the experience with both of you of being part of you starting up your own training programs. And so, 9 years ago or so with Roy, and boy, has that been a journey. And grown so fast with our head spin. And now with Syzygy, Bruce's Training Institute for IFS Informed EMDR, and I have the luck and benefit of being a trainer for both of you, both of those institutes. And I just kind of want to end on what's exciting, what's happening now with your worlds, and what's next, and what do you want to say to that?
Go ahead, Bruce. You're the newbie on the block.
Yeah. It seems so new to me to be. I mean, I've been I made a transformation from sort of a part that's sort of self-protective of hiding in my office and doing my work, so that no one can see me doing it and scrutinize me or criticize me. And to somehow, that part, being able to unburden from whatever worry there was about, well, what would happen if somebody disagreed with me or didn't like what I was doing, and to get to this place where I thought, I really have something to offer. So that was a kind of a transformation, and I started to shift more from just a one-on-one therapist in my private office to teaching workshops, consulting, and just kind of getting better at that, like developing those skills. And then then Nancy, who you both know,
Nancy Simon, yeah,
came to one of my workshops and said, what if I wanted to teach what you're teaching? Are you training people to do that? I thought, gosh, yeah, I guess when I go,
hopefully not for a very long time.
Maybe this goes with me, and nobody's teaching anybody this stuff. So I thought, okay, I guess I got to do that. So there's been a part that's been sort of like, oh, I took on this big project of making this training institute, but it's been really, really rewarding. And one of the things that's been rewarding leading up to it is just the camaraderie of the folks who have come along with me and been guides, assisting me in the trainings, and to see those people kind of just develop professionally and become trainers when they weren't trainers, or just learn my approach, and and more. It's just been really, really rewarding. So I'm very excited about that. And I guess it kind of frees me up a little bit to kind of do workshops or develop workshops that are just kind of just a little off of that, just a little bit outside of that. So I'm excited about those kind of things, and maybe writing, which I have dabbled in but never really produced anything. So I'm hoping that I can stick with it, and maybe get an article out there, or a book. But there is a chapter, and there's a publishing deal with an IFS informed EMDR book that's supposed to come out, I think, about a year from now. So I have the chapter all written, and we'll see, how that stands. But I've started writing a book. I would say I'm roughly about stuck on halfway done with the book, and I just started writing an article. So maybe I'll get a journal article published. So that's kind of what's on the horizon for me with this stuff.
It's
Yeah,
so
that's
exciting.
great.
Yeah, I've loved this process with you. I can't tell you how different the two of you are in the way that you build an institute. It is so different, but benefits from both.
Uh,
Different? What do you mean by different?
Well, you can see even in this interview, Roy is one of his favorite phrases because he was a pilot before. Fly by the seat of your pants. Just let's try. Okay, that sounds good. Let's try that. Let's try that. And Bruce is like, no, we're going to stop and think about that. We're going to work that up until we get to where we want it, and then we're going to put it out there. And I appreciate both. I've had both experiences now, and you kind of go back and forth in my brains as like if I can put both of you together,
Mhm.
it works really well. And I just want to say about what's the website, Bruce? Is it syzygyinstitute.com?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and we do advanced trainings for EMDR therapists. So intro to IFS for EMDR therapists, IFS informed EMDR workshop, second level for EMDR therapists, and then discovery and beyond, which is
Right.
third
So we're referring to those as 3 steps.
step. Sorry, not
Three
level.
steps. And so the first step would be you can't integrate EMDR and IFS if you only really know EMDR.
Yeah. And it's not the same if you say, oh, I know part work. Part
Right.
is
So we
not
want to make sure that if you haven't, found another way to really kind of deepen, experientially your IFS, arsenal, whatever, a bag of tricks, then you really need to take our step 1. But if you've taken, IFS level 1, or beyond, you already know that stuff. Then you're ready for our step 2, and that's where we really, do the systematic integration of the 2 models. And then step 3 would be much more intensive focus on applying that specifically with blended protectors. And so that's the basic 3-step program, and it's all experiential, meaning that each step is 2 days with a lot of supervised practice, heavy staff ratio where you're with a experienced guide who's supporting your practice sessions, and you're learning it both in the client role and also in the therapist role, so you really get a deepening of the experience of the work.
Yeah, it's super fun. Yeah. And Roy, what's next? I mean, there's always something new with Roy. Always.
So you seem to imply that this is sort of like a kind of a creative thing. And
Yeah.
so, as I was thinking about the sort of the historical growth, part of it is, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to say it, you're blessed to receive when you give, I guess, is one of the mottos. And probably for me, being invited just to be able to train for Francine was a door that I hadn't knocked on. I remember listening to a Rotary presentation with a very successful person who made that point. Says it's one thing to knock on doors to try to get through them, but it's another when doors open before you. And sometimes you don't feel prepared, or you don't feel deserving, you don't feel qualified. And I think the courage to just step in and explore doors when they open. Do they all turn out to be successful? No, but to give the opportunity to step in and try. So the long answer is every door that opens, we're going to step through to see what happens. And do I know what all those doors are? They open up all the time. But I think the value of being in a position to share experiences and find that people find it valuable, and another teaching villages to fish. I mean, that's what we're doing, Bruce and Crystal as well, is far beyond what you're doing in that little office, or what I had ever done, or what you're doing. And it's just a wonderful, rewarding experience to have that. and the culture that we're creating of supportive people who have a like mind and like philosophies, and I think again are those who are very giving. And I think that's what I'm sure hearing from what Crystal's talked about your organization as well. It's a giving. It's not receiving and holding on to and trying to protect, but to say we're going to give this, and we're going to plant the seeds. We're going to let those aspects grow. And I've been very fortunate. Yeah, starting off when I made this first step, I said I don't know if this is going to work or not. And then, if not, I'll retire, and that will be what it is. And it just kind of, continue to grow. And I think, I think the other part is always worth mentioning is, and I'm not sure interpersonally the support you have, but I know my wife is extremely supportive. And I've traveled more in the last 10 years or 20 years of our marriage than I had the first 30. And just to have that support across the board is really important. And our organization is just, we are going to open up opportunities and continue to try to provide the foundation for people to comfortably, seamlessly integrate ISF and not fight with, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be here and you're giving me a different box or a peg to fit in. It's like, no, this is such a malleable process that it integrates, and it's a fertile foundation from other things to grow. Is I think the foundation of our approach to EMDR that's evolving beyond this very structured, which it needed to be initially, protocol, to, I don't even use that term because it's more that pilot metaphor of we're acrobatic pilots, we're not commercial pilots. We're always modifying, adapting, and integrating and thinking three-dimensionally and thinking outside the box. So I'm just very blessed to have a system that tries to keep up with me the best they can.
We try so hard.
And so maybe there's that issue. I don't think I've been diagnosed with ADHD, but I certainly get attracted to every door that opens up, and wanting to explore. And I think that's part of our value system, to not look back and say, oh, I wish I had walked through that door. Instead of like, I'm gonna, whatever it is, I've walked through it. Some of them have closed, some of them, that's fine. So I just see us continuing to do what we do and opening up other opportunities, and integrating now this with what you're done, Crystal, is to create another broader community that says this is works hand in hand, theoretically, philosophically, philosophically, and that's all going to give our clients what they need,
Yes.
and our clinicians the confidence and courage to know what they do. And I'm sure, Bruce, you probably have people say, oh, I've already been doing this, or we have people come to our training as a refresher. Oh, I didn't know I could do that. Or it's so nice that I'm not going to be arrested by the EMDR police for doing something that I felt was clinically intuitive, instead of like, we're always going to be doing what's in the best interest of the client. And I'm sure if you're just struggling with an EMDR intervention or an ISF intervention, or what you think is clinically appropriate, you're going to do what's clinically appropriate, and and not say you're locked into one paradigm, and instead of a very malleable kind of membrane instead of a very rigid one. And I think that's probably, Crystal, why we both attracted you. Let's put it that way.
You both opened doors for me I didn't even know I was knocking on, and I decided to step through them, and I'm so glad that I did. I didn't even know I could be a teacher, and it turns out I love it, and I'm pretty darn good at it. So
yeah, and actually, jokingly, probably I reached out of this door and pulled you in.
Oh, he did.
When I just said, Crystal, here's a training, do it. So it was like I pulled her into the training door before I think she even had thought about it. But it was
very true. I'm glad I stepped through. So glad I stepped through. And Roy's, our website is emdrconsulting.com, which is basic trainings, basic EMDR trainings, as well as some advanced workshops, EMDR workshops, one of which is shameless self-promotion, my workshop based on EMDR Toolbox, Jim Knight's work, and he generously and kindly guided me through developing that and carrying his work through forward as well. So I'm so grateful to both of you. I can't even begin to say how grateful I am to both of you, and thanks for the time today. with you, which is the most valuable thing I could get. So
Well, I would share that. Thanks for the time. It's the most valuable thing that I think we can, again, receive and giving, to follow that metaphor. It's just so valuable to share and hear things. And I have a better understanding of IFS. I have not been trained in it. I just kind of, but I can at least speak some of the language and steer people to it. And if they come from that language, I can modify and adapt and integrate those concepts. Certainly, yeah,
It's
great.
been a real pleasure, and an honor to sit with you, Roy, and you know, hang out and compare ideas. I love it. Thanks, Crystal, for the opportunity for, you know, opening this door for us. And I like, you know, what you're saying, Roy, about, you know, open doors and just, you know, having the spirit, you know, to courage, whatever it is, you know, that allows us to just, you know, welcome, you know, the opportunities to walk through these open doors. And also thank you for mentioning the support of people around you, you know, so family, wife, in my case, and all the, you know, the colleagues who, you know, have really supported my work has been just tremendous. So I'm really grateful for that.
yeah, I think we touched on all the C words of IFS: confidence, courage, connection, compassion. All the self qualities that we've brought to our work. So thank you both so much.
All right.
Yeah.